The year is 624 CE. 3 years have passed since the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, fled Mecca with a handful of followers. Hunted by the most powerful tribe in Arabia, they arrived in Medina with nothing: no army, no treasury, no political standing, just a message and the absolute certainty that it was true. But Mecca had not forgotten them, and Mecca did not forgive. To understand the Battle of Badr, you have to understand what the early Muslim community was actually living through. These were not abstract theological debates. This was survival. The Quraysh, Mecca's ruling tribe, had spent 13 years doing everything in their power to destroy Islam before it took root. They tortured the weakest believers. They strangled Bilal ibn Rabah under the desert sun with a boulder on his chest. They boycotted Muslim families, cutting off food and trade until children cried from hunger. When the Prophet finally received permission to migrate to Medina, the Quraysh sent assassins to his home that very night, with orders to kill him before dawn. They failed, but they had not finished. In Medina, the Muslims began to rebuild. But the Quraysh had confiscated everything the migrants left behind: their homes, their businesses, their savings, their land. Entire families had walked away from everything they owned to preserve their faith. The early Muslim community in Medina was economically devastated, politically fragile, and surrounded by tribes who had not yet decided whose side to be on. It was in this context, not from a position of strength but from the edge of extinction, that the Battle of Badr became inevitable. The trigger was a caravan. A massive Qurayshi trade caravan led by Abu Sufyan, one of Mecca's most powerful men, was returning from Syria loaded with goods. The Prophet received word of it and led a force of 313 men to intercept it, not out of aggression, but as an act of economic retaliation. The Muslims were reclaiming, in some small measure, what had been taken from them. Abu Sufyan got wind of the Muslim movement and sent an urgent message to Mecca. What happened next revealed everything about the Quraysh's intentions. They didn't send a small escort. They mobilized an army. Nearly 1,000 men, cavalry, foot soldiers, armored warriors, marched out of Mecca. This was not a defensive response. This was a declaration. The Quraysh had decided the time had come to end the Muslim community once and for all. Abu Sufyan rerouted the caravan safely. The army no longer needed to protect it, but they kept marching. Some voices within the Quraysh ranks counseled turning back. The threat was gone. The caravan was safe. There was no reason to fight. But the powerful leaders, men like Abu Jahl, refused. They wanted a final reckoning. They wanted to march into Medina and return to Mecca as the men who buried Islam in its second home. The Prophet received this intelligence. He called his companions together and consulted them openly, something extraordinary for a leader in 7th century Arabia. He did not command. He asked, "What should we do?" The Muhajirun, the migrants from Mecca, spoke first. They pledged their full support. Then Sa'd ibn Mu'adh rose on behalf of the Ansar. the Medinan Muslims who had opened their city and their homes to the refugees. His words have echoed through history for 14 centuries. "We believe in you," he said. "We have given our covenant to you. Go where God commands you to go. By the one who sent you with the truth, if you marched us into the sea, not one of us would hold back." The army of 313 men marched toward the wells of Badr. They were outnumbered 3-1. The Quraysh had armor, horses, and professional warriors. The Muslims had swords, faith, and almost nothing else. Many had no shoes. Some shared a single camel between 3 men, taking turns walking. They were, by every conventional military calculation, the side that was supposed to lose. They arrived at Badr and made camp near the wells. The night before the battle, rain fell. The Quran would later describe it as a mercy. It settled the sand under the Muslim feet and gave them firm ground to fight on, while the ground on the Quraysh side turned to mud. In the darkness before the battle, the Prophet prayed with an intensity his companions had never witnessed. He stood alone, supplicating to God with everything he had. The fate of the community he had built, the message he had carried for 15 years, the lives of the 313 men sleeping around him, all of it rested on what was coming at dawn. And at dawn, it came.
The Battle of Badr was not just a clash of arms, it was the moment history pivoted. Known as Yawm al-Furqan, it was the day that decided the future of a faith and the fate of a peninsula. For 13 years in Mecca, the early Muslims had endured relentless persecution. They were boycotted, marginalized, and their lives were made a constant struggle for survival. When they finally fled to Medina, in the Hijra of 622 CE, they left everything behind: their homes, their businesses, and their ancestors' land. The Quraysh did not merely let them go. They confiscated the Muslims' property, turning their personal wealth into capital for the Meccan trade dominance. In Medina, the community struggled to find its footing. To reclaim their stolen assets, they began to target the lifeblood of Meccan power, the Syrian trade caravans. In the year 2 AH, word reached Medina of a caravan led by Abu Sufyan. It carried goods worth 50,000 dinars, a fortune that could fund years of Meccan aggression. The Prophet Muhammad decided to intercept this convoy. It was a strategic move to secure the survival of his community and signal that the era of passive suffering was over. But Abu Sufyan was a master of intelligence. He scouted the route himself and discovered the presence of Muslim scouts by examining date pits in camel droppings. Realizing the danger, he diverted the caravan to a coastal route, slipping past the trap. But he also sent an urgent messenger to Mecca to call for backup. His messenger, Damdam, arrived in Mecca with a dramatic and terrifying display, screaming that their wealth was under attack and their honor was at stake. The response was swift. 1,000 Qurayshi warriors, including their greatest noblemen, marched toward Badr. They were well-armed, well-fed, and arrogant. Even when word came that the caravan was safe, Abu Jahl insisted on proceeding. He wanted to show the world that anyone who challenged Mecca would be crushed. Both armies arrived at Badr. The stage was set in a narrow valley, surrounded by jagged hills and the silence of the deep desert. It was here that Hubab ibn al-Mundir offered a critical tactical insight. He suggested the Muslims occupy the wells closest to the enemy, depriving them of water. This decision changed the landscape of the battle. The Muslims would have water, while the larger Meccan force would have to fight under the sun's thirst. The morning of the 17th of Ramadan, 2 AH. The two armies faced each other across the valley of Badr. On one side, 1,000 Qurayshi warriors in formation, experienced, armed, confident. On the other, 313 Muslims. They had spent the night in prayer and knew with absolute clarity what defeat would mean. Not just their deaths. If they fell here, it would be the death of everything they believed in. The battle began in the Arab tradition, with single combat. Three of the Quraysh's greatest warriors stepped forward. Utbah ibn Rabi'a, his brother Shayba, and his son Al-Walid. Champions, men whose names commanded fear across Arabia. The Prophet sent forward three of his own. He sent Hamza, his uncle, Ali, his cousin, and Ubaidah ibn al-Harith. Within moments, Hamza killed Shayba. Ali killed Al-Walid. Ubaidah and Utbah wounded each other fatally, and Hamza delivered the finishing blow. Three Qurayshi champions were down. What followed was unlike anything Arabia had seen. The Quraysh charged, expecting a quick rout. What they encountered was something military historians would study as an example of psychological and tactical unity. The Muslims fought with a coherence, a shared purpose so absolute that individual fear seemed to dissolve into something larger than themselves. The accounts describe companions who threw away their dates mid-meal to rush into the fighting the moment they heard the battle cry. Young men who had never held a sword in combat stood their ground against seasoned warriors twice their age. While the lines held, the Prophet Muhammad prayed with such intensity that his cloak fell from his shoulders, pleading for the success of his people. He took a handful of dust and threw it toward the enemy ranks. At that moment, a powerful wind blew the sand into the eyes of the Quraysh. Historical and Quranic accounts describe the descent of thousands of angels to bolster the hearts and ranks of the believers. Abu Jahl, the man who had led the campaign to destroy Islam from its earliest days, fell in that valley. He was found by two young men from Medina, teenagers, and was struck down before the morning was over. When the Prophet was told where Abu Jahl's body lay, he went to look. He did not celebrate. He stood quietly. The suffering was over. The man who had made his people suffer for 15 years was gone. The battle lasted hours. When it ended, the world had changed. 70 Qurayshi warriors were dead, and 70 more were taken prisoner. The Muslims lost only 14 men. 14. Against a force 3 times their size, with a fraction of the equipment, they had won by a margin that stunned the entire Arabian Peninsula. The shockwaves were immediate. Tribes watching cautiously suddenly had their answer. The invincibility of the Quraysh had cracked. But the significance of Badr goes far deeper than military outcome. It became a foundation for Islamic jurisprudence and ethics. The Prophet's treatment of the prisoners became a historic event. In 7th century Arabia, prisoners were typically enslaved or executed. Not here. The Prophet consulted his companions. Some advocated for execution, others for ransom. The decision reached was primarily ransom, and in a detail that speaks volumes, literate prisoners who had no money were given an alternative. Teach 10 children to read. That is your ransom. In the middle of a war for survival, the Prophet ransomed prisoners with literacy. Knowledge was the foundation. This decision tells you what kind of civilization was being constructed. Not one built on tribal loyalty alone, but on the value of the mind. The Quran dedicated an entire chapter to Badr. Surah Al-Anfal, the chapter of the spoils. It was a manual for victory. It didn't just narrate the victory, it taught the community what to do with a win, how to distribute the spoils justly and treat enemies with dignity. It taught them that arrogance would corrupt everything the battle had been fought for. Victory was not theirs alone. The lessons of Badr became the moral architecture of early Islamic governance. Justice in victory, consultation before decisions, care for the vulnerable. These were not abstract principles. They were forged in an actual valley, by actual human beings who were afraid and exhausted, and who won anyway. 14 centuries later, in 2026, the Battle of Badr remains one of the most studied events in human history. It is referenced in sermons from Jakarta to London, analyzed by military strategists and theologians alike. It appears in the names of streets, institutions, and organizations across the Muslim world. A legacy that persists. And what is it that keeps drawing people back to that valley? It is the story of a community that had every reason to believe it was finished. Persecuted, expelled, hunted across a desert, and they still chose to stand. Not from calculation, but from faith. It is something that has no tactical category and no place on a battlefield assessment form. They believed with every cell in their bodies. In the logic of history, as in the logic of Badr itself, that turned out to matter more than numbers. 313 men walked into that valley. The world that walked out was different from the one that walked in. It always is, when people are willing to stand for something larger than themselves. Today, the names of the 14 who fell remain inscribed in stone, a testament to the courage that forged a new world. Badr remains a lesson in the power of purpose, the value of knowledge, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Standing for truth, even when outnumbered, is the legacy of Badr, a turning point that continues to resonate today.